All right, welcome back to the second part of Lecture 2. I'm going to talk about some of the implications of the action-guiding and agreement-seeking nature of ethics. First, two implications of the action-guiding nature are that ought implies can and that there's a gap between is and ought. Now, what do I mean by this? Ought implies can means that a person cannot be ethically required to do something if they're unable to do it, if they cannot do it. To be ethically obliged to do something requires that you can do it or that you're able to do it. And this sort of makes sense, right? You cannot be ethically obliged to fly across the courtyard to the other side of the quadrangle or whatever. It just doesn't, you're not able to do it and you can't be obliged to do it. And that's because ethical judgments are action guiding, and it doesn't guide your action if it obliges you to do something you can't do. So that's ought implies can. The is-ought gap is slightly different. The is-ought gap is the idea that you cannot derive an ethical conclusion from purely factual premises. You cannot derive something about what ought to be the case from something that is the case. Let me show you that. Here's the first thing, this ought implies can, has consequences for moral accountability, because you cannot be held accountable, morally accountable, for actions that you're unable to do. You're not morally responsible for failing to bring about world peace, because that's not something that you can do. And it's an excusing condition, right? It excuses you from moral accountability, the fact that you are unable to do something. And we have to be careful to look for conditions like that when we're doing ethics. The is-ought gap, the idea that you cannot derive an ought from an is, was first noticed by the English philosopher David Hume back in the 1700s. And I was always very impressed by this idea, and it certainly started me thinking about ethics when I suddenly realized that there was more to the world than just science. So, and here's Hume's statement of this problem about trying to derive an ought from an is. It's sometimes rather affectionately known as Hume's guillotine, because it cuts off an argument between the set of premises saying the way the world is and the conclusion that says the way the world ought to be. So let me read Hume here. In every system of morality which I have hitherto met with, I have always remarked that the author proceeds for some time in the ordinary way of reasoning, when of a sudden I am surprised to find that, instead of the usual copulation of propositions, is and is not, I meet with no proposition that is not connected with an ought or an ought not. This change is imperceptible, but is, however, of the last consequence. I think here last consequence means greatest consequence. For as this ought or ought not expresses some new relation or affirmation, it is necessary that it should be observed and explained, and at the same time that a reason should be given for what seems altogether inconceivable, how this new relation can be a deduction from others which are entirely different from it. There is a gap between the way the world is and the way the world ought to be, and it actually follows from the idea that value judgments are action guiding, because the way the world is does not guide action, and the way the world ought to be does guide action. So something has been added when you've moved from factual premises to an ethical conclusion, and you have to account for where that came from. Now, there are also two implications of the agreement-seeking nature of ethical judgments. The agreement-seeking nature of ethical judgments is the idea that when we say something is right or wrong, we generally want other people to agree with us. It doesn't mean we'll achieve agreement, but we strive for agreement. Strive for agreement amongst everybody about what the ethical judgments should be. One consequence is that ethical judgments are universal in their application. If you and I are in the same situation, then something that applies to you also applies to me. It would not be very useful for me to say, well, you and I, we both have the same amount of money, and et cetera, but you should give to charity, and I don't have to. you're never going to get any agreement about that, right? Because there's no reason why this should apply to you but not to me. So that, in order to preserve the agreement-seeking nature of ethical judgments have to be universal. Now, one view that denies universality is this view, ethical relativism. And we're going to spend a fair bit of this, well, particularly the next part of this lecture, looking at ethical relativism, what it means, and what we might be able to do with it, and what might be wrong with it particularly. Ethical relativism says that what is right or wrong for a person depends on that person's cultural membership. And an implication of the agreement-seeking nature of ethical judgment is that ethical relativism is a very weak claim, because agreement-seekingness implies universality, and ethical relativism denies universality. So we'll look at more at what comes out of that in a moment. Ethical relativism claims that what's right or wrong for a person depends on what culture that person belongs to. It entails things like, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, right? This is the old saying, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. And it would mean, if it were true, that things like, it might, in a bribe-paying culture, a culture where bakshish is the norm, then it would be ethically permissible for any businessman who is visiting, a business person who's visiting that culture, to pay those bribes, even though it might not be ethically permissible in the business person's home culture. Okay, so it does apply. The world is full of different cultures, and if ethical relativism is true, it may mean that ethical judgments have to be changed depending on what culture you go to. Ethical relativism does have a couple of apparent strengths. The first thing is it seems to express a toleration. The cultural diversity is a fact. It's just as a matter of anthropology, different cultures have different views on what to eat and how to eat it. Do you use a knife and fork? Do you use chopsticks? Do you put your knife down when you're eating with your fork, or do you keep them both in your hand? They differ. Different cultures differ on how to dress, on what people's obligations are to their next of kin. They disagree on how people should express respect to one another. Not that maybe that they should respect one another, but how they should express it. They disagree on things like on how and with whom it's permissible to have sex, whether there's God and how you should worship Him, etc. So it seems possible, if you're willing to tolerate those sorts of things, that you should also tolerate people's differing ethical judgments, and therefore that ethical relativism is an important meta-ethical doctrine. And people also sometimes believe in ethical relativism because they're relativists in general. They believe that there's no such thing as universal truth, that truth is that what's true for me may be different from what's true for you. So we'll look at those reasons, and we'll look at some replies in the next part of this lecture. Meanwhile, have a look at this question here. Which of the following is the best example of the principle that ought implies can? Okay, so ought implies can, not the is-ought gap. Okay, so pause the video for a moment and think about these and read them through. Commit yourself to one of the answers, and we'll come back in a second and see what we make of it. Welcome back. Which of the following is the best example of the principle of ought implies can? Okay, the business owner who espouses fundamentalist religious beliefs quickly promoted the able atheist. Well, this is an example of toleration. Somebody who espouses quite strong religious beliefs probably does not agree with atheism, but it's not an example of ought implies can. It's something the business owner is able to do, so there's no issue there. Number B, question B, answer B. Because of the year's heavy losses, the board of directors decided that the company should not make its usual charitable donations. Now this is a possibility, right? Because what's going on here is the board of directors is saying, well, we should be excused from our usual charitable donations because we're doing so badly. It would demand too much of us to give out charitable donations because of all the year's heavy losses. So let's go back, let's reserve that one and look, this is a possibility, okay? So we won't cross it out just yet. But it's important when you do any sort of multiple choice question to look at all the other answers. Don't just jump to the one you think is correct. Because it always says which is the best example. So maybe there's a better example. People and businesses ought to act so as to maximize the welfare of all members of society. Well, that's just a simple statement of utilitarianism, right? So that is not got something to do with ought implies can. Looking at the decisions made by companies that he admired, in number D, the manager decided to act in a similar way. Well, he's looking at the decisions of virtuous companies, other companies that have exhibited virtue, and the manager is saying, well, I'll act similar to virtuous people, but that's not a case of ought implies can. The best example of this is B, as we saw earlier. Because of the year's heavy losses, it would be too onerous. It would demand too much of us for the board of directors to give charitable donations that year. It's not that they absolutely can't do it. I mean, they could perhaps still go to the bank and borrow money to make their charitable donations, but it would require too much of them. Okay, so the best answer here is B. I'll see you in a moment.